2008, I got my PhD, and of course the economy collapsed just then, and then humanities departments started not hiring. So I went to my fans, my readers, and said, if I can raise enough money to cancel my student debt, I'll do any research project you want. I'll apply my PhD to anything that it would be applicable to. And unanimously, all the donors who came in for this said, historicity of Jesus, we want you to apply your PhD and your knowledge now to finally doing a proper peer-reviewed scholarly treatment of this subject that's usually been treated by amateurs and outsiders. I treated it like a research grant, took it seriously, and endeavored to produce the best books I could on this subject. The first book that came out, Proving History, in 2012, the way I organized it is the first things I described the problem. But in chapter 2, that I covered what I call the basic axioms, the basic assumptions of rational empirical history. But then I have a chapter explaining what Bayes' theorem is, and that's part of what I'm going to talk about today. And then I apply that to historical methods. I look at how historians generally, what sorts of methodologies do they use, what sorts of, how do they become convinced of a claim in history. And then I show that the way historians are already reasoning is already Bayesian. They're already using Bayes' theorem, so the question is, are they doing it well or poorly? But then I apply it specifically to the Jesus Studies issue and show that all of the attempts to try and extract historical information from the Gospels don't hold up. I found that all of the scholars in this field of Jesus Studies who did any kind of study on the methods being used, they all agree that they don't work. So what I do in this chapter is I cite and quote them all throughout, but at the same time show that what they're saying makes sense from a Bayesian perspective. I stuck all the hard stuff in chapter 6, so the really heavy mathematical stuff that you probably find incredibly boring if you're not interested in these deeper questions about math. All of the harder mathematical concepts I stuck in the last chapter because I figured people who want that stuff can keep reading, people who don't want it can stop there and just skip to the conclusion. That's the organization of Proving History. That came out in 2012. And the thinking of it was, when I first took on this project, the first task you do when you're ever doing a historical research project like this is you resolve issues of method. Looking at what methods Jesus historians were using, they were terrible, and everybody agreed they were terrible. And so I realized I had to start from scratch. And at this point, I started to understand Bayesian reasoning better, and I started to realize that that was the way forward. So the first book I had to produce had to be on method, and then the next book would be on application. I took Bayesian reasoning and applied it to the facts of the history of Jesus. And in the next book on the historicity of Jesus, which just came out this year, once again, start by describing the problem. I devoted a whole chapter on how do we define historicity? What does it mean for Jesus to have existed? And then I have another chapter on alternative hypothesis. How do we explain the origins of Christianity if there wasn't a historical Jesus? And what I do is I carefully define both hypotheses so that they can be compared in the rest of the book. 2 of the whole chapters, 4 and 5, to background knowledge, because one of the biggest barriers I ran into in studying this, and spoke to many scholars all over the place, every expert in the field I spoke to didn't know some key fact relevant to understanding the historicity of Jesus, or thought something was true that was false. I was on London radio debating this with Mark Goodacre, who's a professor of New Testament studies, a superb professor, a superb expert in the field, one of my favorite scholars in the field. And in this debate, he was insisting that there was a verse in the epistles of Paul that's not there. And I told him that verse isn't there, and he said, no, it really is. And so during the commercial break, we looked, and it's not. And he was surprised. And he's a secular historian. He's not a fundamentalist. He's not promoting Christianity in that sense. And that was just one example of many. And I find that the gaps in knowledge that I've encountered are different for every scholar. So in order to educate everybody, I'd have 2 whole chapters just on, okay, there's 48 basic facts, and then I establish them with the scholarship and evidence and stuff so that we can agree that they're true and fine. So if you're looking at why the book is so thick, a lot of it has to do with that, is that there was a lot of real groundwork that had to be done that was kind of being skipped in the field. And a lot of even secular scholars in Jesus Studies are operating from a base of assumptions that was actually inherited from Christian faith assumptions, and they never questioned them. So oftentimes when they cite the consensus, that's a consensus that was actually inherited from a Christian background, even though they themselves might not be Christian, even though they have no idea that that's where it came from. And they just haven't fact-checked every single element of the consensus like this. But then, of course, you're doing Bayesian reasoning, as I'll explain shortly. The first thing you have to figure out is what is the prior probability. So I have a whole chapter on how do you determine that for a historical person, whether they existed or not. And then I have a chapter explaining the evidence. What is the evidence we have? What do we know about it? And that kind of stuff. And then what I do is I go through the book. I start with the non-biblical evidence, then I do the book of Acts in the New Testament, canonical Acts, and I do the canonical Gospels, and then the epistles. And each one of them, I analyze what's in them and then ask how likely would that content be there if Jesus existed versus not. And then, of course, I wrap it up in a conclusion. In each chapter, I talk about what my estimates of probability are. I have 2 estimates. The one that is most against my view as possible, the one that is most in favor of the historicity of Jesus I can think is reasonably possible, and then the probability estimate that I personally as a historian think is correct. And then I do the math for both to show the upper and lower bounds of the error margin for this thing. And then in the conclusion, I have it all tabled out for you, so if you want to insert your own estimates, you can do that and see what the conclusion follows from your own assumptions. I mentioned before the idea that scholars have realized that there's no methodologies that work in the field, even though they keep using them. 𝐏𝐫𝐸𝐬𝐻 describing this view in the field as there are no reliable criteria for separating authentic from inauthentic Jesus tradition. Dale Allison, our criteria have not led to any uniformity of result or any more uniformity than would have been the case had we never heard of them, for example. Helen Koester, the vast variety of interpretations of the historical Jesus that the current quest has proposed is bewildering. In other words, the methods are producing wildly divergent conclusions. James Charlesworth says, what had been perceived to be a developing consensus in the 1980s has collapsed into a chaos of opinions. So the methods aren't working, right? My favorite quote, though, is by Hector Avalos. Scholars on both sides, liberal and conservative, usually construct portraits of Jesus that mirror themselves in terms of theology, politics, and ethical values. The fact that neither side has produced any verifiable knowledge about Jesus forms yet another argument to end biblical studies as we know it. So what is the basic logical form of historical argument? All historical argument is probabilistic. All premises consist of statements of probability, overt or covert. Hypotheses in history assert what most likely happened in the past, and what is the most likely explanation why it happened. Those are the 2 kinds of hypotheses that historians propose and try to create historical knowledge out of. All historical argument pertains to how probable a hypothesis is relative to all other competing hypotheses, given all we know in general about the nature of the world and history and so on, and given the evidence we have for the particular issue. That is key, that last part there. Now, this is Bayes' theorem. this is a mathematical model for all correct empirical reasoning. So if you understand this mathematical model, you can figure out when someone is making a sound or an unsound argument about facts of the world. The basic principle is, it's the correct mathematical model of all sound historical reasoning, is the argument of proving history, whether you are aware of it or not. So this is the equation, but it sort of translates roughly into this. The probability of your theory, let's call it H, equals, how typically is H true? How typically is your theory true in past cases of similar nature? Times how likely is the evidence that you have if your hypothesis is true. Then you take that and you add it to the multiplication of how typically is it false, times how likely is the evidence otherwise. And this really reduces to 3 numbers, because that fourth number is just the converse of the first number. You have a 20% there, 80% goes in the other one, right? So it adds up to 100%. I mentioned before, this is the basic form of all historical argument. Plain statement of English doesn't look mathematical at all, right? This is the same thing. H is the hypothesis, E is the evidence we have, and B is our background knowledge. What that is an actual mathematical restatement, just a translation into mathematics of this plain English statement that we saw at the top here. What's called a prior probability. It's the probability of your hypothesis given your background knowledge, given all your previous knowledge. So how likely is your hypothesis before we even consider the evidence for that specific hypothesis? In other words, based only on past experience, based on science, based on general knowledge and all of that. The other factor in there, the other number, is the probability of the evidence given your hypothesis and that same background knowledge. In other words, how likely is the evidence, E, if H, your hypothesis, is actually true? In other words, let's assume it's true, what would we expect to see, and is that what we actually see? So how well does the evidence we have fit what we would expect to have? In the how well part, you would measure that in terms of probability. How likely is that what we would see? The third number is the opposite of that in a sense. It's the probability of the evidence if your hypothesis is false and given the same background knowledge. So how likely is the evidence E if H is actually false? In other words, how well does the evidence we have fit what we would expect to have on any other hypothesis? And in fact, you can build out the equation to cover numerous hypotheses simultaneously. It doesn't have to be binary, true, false. One way to think of it is these probabilities are like weights on a scale. So you put a weight representing how typical is it, and that represents how likely is it. And then you would ask how likely is the evidence on your hypothesis, and you put that weight on the scale. And then you put similar weights on the other side of the scale, and it'll tip one way or another, right? How typical our explanation is times how expected the evidence is if our explanation is true, over a little other equation that says how atypical our explanation is times how expected the evidence is if our explanation isn't true. And you can do that using the little weight scales if you want to see it visually. One example that I go through in detail in chapter 3 of Proving History is the passage in Mark in the later Gospels which says that the sun went dark for 3 hours. Now it went dark for 3 hours at a time when it's the full moon, when you can't actually have a solar eclipse. So when you reject that, you say that's absurd, it didn't really happen. When they argue it, they're using Bayesian reasoning, because this is what they already do. They're saying that the probability that the sun went out equals how typically does the sun actually go out? I mean, this doesn't happen very often. Conversely to how typically are such claims made up? Well, people make claims up like that all the time. So we know it's extremely common to make these stories up. It's extremely uncommon for them to be true. And that gives us our prior probability. That's our first number. So that leaves the other 2 numbers. How likely is the evidence we have if that happened against how likely is the evidence we have if this story was made up and it didn't happen? And of course, the obvious things when you look at the evidence is that had it happened, it would have been reported by every astronomer and historian of the era. It would have been widely attested. It would have been attested inside and outside the Roman Empire, because there were people watching the sky and recording astronomical events everywhere, including Babylon and so on. But no one noticed it, except one dude, the author of Mark, who's not even an eyewitness, you can't even establish that he was there, or even that he's reporting anything that anybody told him. And then all the other versions of the claim are just repeats of his version of the claim. So that's exactly what we would expect if the claim was made up. It's not at all what we'd expect if the claim was true, and that gives us a huge disparity in those 2 probabilities, and that gives us the other 2 numbers. And that's when you do the math on those 3 numbers, what you end up with is almost certainly this did not happen. The probability is extremely low. Now the typical objections I hear, and I address them in Proving History, is that historical reasoning isn't mathematical. Historical reasoning isn't that precise. They always talk about, well, it can't be 87.896% because history's not that precise. Or math is too hard, and we don't want to do it. Now, there's obvious responses to this. I mean, all historical reasoning is probabilistic. Let's just accept that. You can't get away from that fact. And all probabilistic reasoning is mathematical by definition. So you're already doing math. If you're not thinking about it seriously, you're just doing it badly. So you have to accept that it's mathematical. The upshot of all of this is that we get a Bayesian logic of evidence. When you talk about when is something evidence for something else, or how strong is that evidence? Well, Bayes' theorem actually helps you answer that question. It gives you a mathematical model of what you're actually talking about. And so here I'm saying E, which is evidence. E is not evidence for H, your hypothesis, if E is equally likely if your hypothesis is false. In other words, if it's exactly what you would expect whether your hypothesis was true or false, then E is not evidence for your hypothesis. That's one thing Bayes' theorem teaches you. Another is that E is weak evidence for your hypothesis if E is only slightly less likely on not H. In other words, if it's, you kind of almost expect the same thing if your hypothesis was false, if it's only slightly more likely if your hypothesis is true, then you look E is weak evidence. That's what it means to say that E is weak evidence. And then you get, of course, strong evidence. If my slideshow will obey my commands, there we go. E is strong evidence for H if E is much less likely on the alternative hypothesis, which in fact gives you the counterintuitive result that the thing you most want to find is something that's extremely improbable on any other explanation than yours. And then finally, the last thing it teaches you, E is strong evidence for H if E is much less likely on not H, unless E is only more likely on H if H has been gerrymandered by an argumentum ad hoc. And this is something I'm sure many of you have encountered with believers of various stripes arguing the moment you say, well, the predictions don't bear out. Like if the existence of God is a classic example. It's like if God existed, we should see all kinds of stuff that we're not seeing. And so they'll invent a ton of excuses that conveniently explain exactly why God makes the universe look exactly like a universe without a God in it. Now, that is a trick that you can actually show mathematically that what they're doing is that they're increasing the probability of the evidence on their hypothesis by vastly reducing the probability of their hypothesis at the level of prior probability. In other words, they're making their hypothesis incredibly complicated, and that just decreases their prior probability. So it actually makes the probability of their conclusion less, not more, because that prior probability always has to be accounted for. So that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. We have that weight scale again. We have very low prior, it's very light, it doesn't weigh very much. Very high prior weighs a lot, so it's tipping the scales very much against the hypothesis. That's an extraordinary claim, modeled with blocks on a scale. So if you want to get the scale to tip the other way, in other words, in favor of the hypothesis, you need a really big block. You need to add a really big block to that side. That means that the probability of evidence must be very much larger than the probability of the evidence on the alternative. And once you understand that mathematically, it opens doors in your mind, and you start to realize you can do a lot with this. Same thing with absence of evidence is sometimes evidence of absence, and Occam's razor, adding assumptions lowers the prior probability. That's because any assumption you add to a theory, you start with a basic theory, you add an assumption, that assumption itself has a probability of being false, right? It's not a 100% guarantee that that excuse is going to be true. When you actually calculate how likely is that excuse, oftentimes if you're just making it up, you're just pulling it out of your ass. And it will have at best a 50-50 chance of being true, but that means that 50% now multiplies by the prior probability. So you just cut the prior probability of your hypothesis in half the moment you added that excuse. It gets worse when you add a really improbable excuse, where you can say that, it's very unlikely that that excuse is true. Let's say it's 1% chance that that excuse is true. Well, now you've just divided your prior probability by 100. You just cut it, and you can show how this works mathematically, and I go into this in proving history about how adding assumptions actually reduces the prior and thus reduces the probability of your conclusion. Another way of arguing that historians often use is inference to the best explanation, or argument to the best explanation, where you look for 5 criteria of an explanation of something, and the best one on all these criteria is the most likely to be true. Explanatory fitness, plausibility, explanatory scope, ad hocness, how ad hoc do you have to make the theory, explanatory power, all of these things. Now, the interesting thing is that this is just a colloquialization of Bayesian reasoning. And you can show that when you look at plausibility, for example. Best explanation will fit our background knowledge better than any other. That's a covert way of referring to prior probability. In other words, background evidence. How likely is the hypothesis just on our background evidence? That's what plausibility means. Plausibility is just a colloquial way of saying prior probability. Ad hocness. I remember I was talking about when you complicate the theory, you reduce the prior probability. It's the same thing. Best explanation will rely on fewer undemonstrated assumptions than any others. Well, that's because, mathematically, adding undemonstrated assumptions reduces the prior probability. So these are just 2 different ways of talking about prior probability. When we get to explanatory power, best explanation will usually render the facts more probable than any other. That is a straightforward statement of the likelihood factor in Bayesian reasoning. And then explanatory scope, best explanation will explain more facts than any other. You can show mathematically that that's the same kind of thing. So it's another way of saying the same thing in a different context. Explanatory fitness, best explanation will usually not contradict well-known or well-confirmed facts. That's because contradicting makes the evidence unlikely, and that again is that 3rd number in Bayesian reasoning. So those 3 other numbers up here, or 3 other criteria up here, are just different ways of talking about those 2 other numbers. Likelihood of the evidence if the hypothesis is true, or the likelihood of the evidence if the hypothesis is false. So even the argument to the best explanation is just Bayes' theorem. Now, when we get to the study of Jesus, things get really wild. And this is a list of historicity criteria. It's not even complete. I'm not going to go through them all, don't worry. I go through about 18 of them in the book, Proving History. I go through them one by one and cite the literature that the scholars have commented on pro and con, but they all malfunction. And they malfunction not necessarily because they're intrinsically faulty, although some of them are. They would never work in any historical field. Some of them malfunction because they can't be applied to Christian history because we don't have the kind of evidence that we would need to apply them to. That's part of the problem in the whole area. One of the most common you'll hear, though, is the criterion of embarrassment. Christians would not record something embarrassing to them unless it were true, right? Therefore, if it's embarrassing, it must be true. And then, well, that's settled, right? Well, no, not really. For example, things that made their mission harder or that helped their critics. They would sooner hide it or change it. And this is a Bayesian statement, right? They're saying that that evidence would be improbable unless the claim were true. So they're actually talking about one of those 3 numbers. Now, there's a problem with this. It actually matches up in the legal sphere with statement against interest. There's a whole literature in the law journals about statement against interest and when it's applicable, when it's not, when it's reliable, when it's not. Interestingly, the historians who talk about the criterion of embarrassment never read any legal literature on statement against interest and why lawyers really don't trust it. Because if they did, they realized they probably shouldn't trust it themselves. In biblical studies or in New Testament studies in particular, one is that embarrassing material would probably have been suppressed in later stages. In other words, when Mark, for example, is writing his book down, he's already writing after the gospel has been preached across 3 continents for 40 years at least. If there was embarrassing stuff in that, it would have been erased from the record before you even got to him. So you have to explain why is it still there, why are Christians still claiming it? And when historians try to come up with these explanations, they don't make sense. There's actually probably a better reason why something would be preserved so faithfully in the tradition. It's because it meant something to them. There was a reason why they needed that story to be true. Whether it was embarrassing or not would be irrelevant to them. We don't have a preposterous omniscience. There are a variety of scholars who've made something like this argument. Morna Hooker is one of them, a major biblical scholar. She said, we don't actually know enough about the first 40 years of the Christian evangelization to actually know what was embarrassing to them. We'll find something in Mark that Mark shows no embarrassment at. But then a later author like Luke will come along and show some sort of embarrassment at something that Mark said. But that only proves that later Christians were embarrassed by it. It doesn't show that the original Christians were embarrassed by it. And then another is any reason to include it is a reason to invent it. A classic example that I use is the castration of Attis. There's a cult going around that was competing with Christianity at the time. It was very popular. Had the official endorsements from the Roman Empire. Priests of Attis would castrate themselves in honor of the god because their god that they worship castrated himself. Historically, right? This never occurred. Castration was at the time one of the most humiliating and debasing things that you could imagine doing. It was probably the most embarrassing thing you could claim about your god is that he cut his own balls off, right? And yet, we have these fanatics going around insisting that that was the case. That was a fundamental part of their gospel, to the point that they were even castrating themselves in honor of it. But there was no Attis. We can't argue that this is so embarrassing that there had to have been an actual god Attis who actually castrated himself. It doesn't make any sense. No, there are a particular different variety of reasons why religions come up with embarrassing claims and stick to them. And it doesn't mean that they're historically true. One of the most famously studied examples is Jesus' cry on the cross. In Mark, for example, he says, "What God, why have you forsaken me?" There was no way that Christians would preserve that saying, because they thought Jesus was God, he was awesome, why would he feel that dejection and say such a thing? So it must be true. It must have been something that he actually said. Many experts have come along, like Meyer, who's one of the major leading experts on Jesus studies. Many other scholars know this. It's not like he was the first to notice it. Is that in fact that's just a quotation of the Psalms, right? And in fact, the entire crucifixion narrative is borrowing elements from that Psalm. The Psalm appears to be the basis for the crucifixion narrative. More than that, as Meyer shows, and I document this and I have the citations and scholarship and everything in my book, Proving History. As he points out, is that this whole idea of the abandoned righteous hero who was later vindicated was a common heroic trope in Jewish mythology at the time. Mark had a particular reason to invent this in order to portray a particularly accepted and understood martyr trope. And because it's a quotation of the Psalms, and the Psalms are obviously a structural basis for the thing, for the whole story, it's clearly not an eyewitness account, it's clearly not something that actually happened. So the idea of it being embarrassing doesn't get you to the truth of it. So you can't get history out of that. And Mark Goodacre, again, pointed out a pretty funny remark, and he said, criterion of embarrassment. They wouldn't write it down unless it was true. And then there's a criterion of multiple attestation. If it's being written about everywhere, it must be true. And that doesn't hold up either. But as he points out, if everybody's saying it, it's multiple attestation, everybody loves including it in their story, doesn't that kind of argue against it being embarrassing? When you have these criteria like that, they actually contradict each other and get logically contradictory results. And even Jesus scholars, even biblical historians are pointing this out. Now, one of the most famous examples that you'll hear is John's baptism of Jesus. Why would Jesus, or why would authors who are trying to tell stories about Jesus admit that Jesus submitted himself to John as his superior for a baptism that cleanses him of sin, which would be admitting that Jesus was sinner and therefore had to have baptism to be sinless? Mark's whole story is the idea that Jesus' flesh was sinless after baptism and that he was superior after his resurrection. When we actually look at the story, John does not say Jesus subordinated himself to John. To the contrary, Mark goes out of his way to have John declare Jesus his superior and successor. Now that's not a statement against interest. That's exactly the kind of thing that Mark would invent. And also, in fact, the entire story has Christ serving as a model for Christians, because the entire story is a story about what baptism means. This is very commonly how mythology gets constructed, is you have a ritual like baptism, and then you have to come up with a story that explains what is that ritual and where did it come from. You see this in mythologies for all religions throughout the world. What we're looking at here is exactly the same thing. It's called an etiological myth, a myth that explains the origin of something, but it's not historically true. The whole idea of submitting yourself to baptism, being cleansed of sin, and thus being immediately adopted by God as God's son, is exactly what baptism meant to Christians. And as we have in the letters of Paul, all baptized Christians are the adopted sons of God. So that in fact, this is just an etiological myth for what baptism means. This is an allegory for it. Mark is not trying to actually say something historical about what Jesus did. He's actually just trying to model an idea in their religion. So all of that, and if you go through the items like that, there are actual obvious reasons why Mark would invent this story. Now, it was only later authors who started taking these stories literally, started to get embarrassed by it, and thus started editing it out, which is exactly what you would expect if they were embarrassed by it, right? But Mark didn't edit it out, nor did anyone in the 40 years before him in transmitting the story, if it was transmitted at all. But the point being is that embarrassment only arose later. So we can do math on this. The probability that Jesus was really baptized by John. Now, I'm just going to throw some arbitrary numbers in here. You can put any numbers you want in. When you start thinking about how high or how low can you go on those numbers, you can see what your margins of error are on your own thinking. So the probability that Jesus was really baptized by John, we have the first number. Mark typically doesn't include things he doesn't want to. In fact, everything in there serves a purpose, and that's pretty typical for authors. And we could say, let's just throw in, make that a 1 in 3 chance that Mark would put that in there if it was historically true. Because if it wasn't historically true and it was embarrassing, he'd probably just leave it out altogether like John did. Now, the true event, if this was a true event, it would be unlikely to produce such a convenient story. When you look at Mark's version of the story, it's very convenient. In fact, it's too convenient. That looks unlikely as a matter of history. It looks exactly like what we would expect if Mark is inventing the story. So I'm just throwing in 1 in 3, 1 in 3, 1 in 3 chance that that's what really happened and would produce that version of the story. So then we add that, again, we get, then Mark typically makes stuff up. Remember that number is just the converse of the other, so 1 and 3 on top, 2 and 3 on the bottom. The third number. False story will always have every convenient feature desired. In fact, it's exactly what we would expect. The story looks exactly like we would expect for an etiological myth, so its probability we can say is 100%. When you plug all those in, you get numbers, you get 1 in 7 chance that Jesus was really baptized by John, which is basically 14%. So probably not. However you look at it, you end up with basically some low probability that it's historical, which is the exact opposite of the argument from embarrassment, right? So that's how Bayesian reasoning can help you really look at, does this make sense logically? And you can actually plug in different values to see what would you have to commit to get the conclusion you want. And so there's lots of different ways you can play around with these numbers to see what happens. Do you want to see more on all of that? That's in my book on the historicity of Jesus, on the methodology. However, if you want to learn more about that, that's Proving History. So, thank you.